The Diocese of Hispania entered the 5th century as a critical administrative component of the Western Roman Empire, managed under the broader jurisdiction of the Praetorian Prefecture of the Gauls. This administrative unit comprised 5 core peninsular provinces: Tarraconensis, Carthaginensis, Betica, Lusitania, and Galaecia, along with the North African province of Mauritania Tingitana. Political authority was centralized in Augusta Emerita, where the vicarius oversaw a complex bureaucracy designed to facilitate the extraction of the annona tax and the maintenance of the cursus publicus, the imperial postal and transport system. However, the fiscal stability and territorial integrity of these provinces were fundamentally undermined by the systemic crisis that followed the crossing of the Rhine in 406. By the autumn of 409, the Pyrenees were breached not by a single unified force, but by a predatory coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi. This incursion was largely facilitated by the internal Roman power struggle between the usurper Constantine III and his general Gerontius, which left the mountain passes unguarded and the local defenses in disarray. The subsequent partition of 411 saw the Silingi Vandals occupy Betica, the Alans take Lusitania and Carthaginensis, and the Hasdingi Vandals and Suebi settle in Galaecia. Although the Roman state attempted to maintain a semblance of order through the granting of hospitalitas, a legal framework for billeting barbarian troops, and the signing of foedera, or treaties, the central government's ability to collect taxes began to evaporate. The curiales, the hereditary class of urban magistrates responsible for local tax collection, found themselves increasingly unable to fulfill their financial obligations to the imperial treasury. This economic pressure led many of the elite to abandon their civic duties and flee to their fortified rural estates. This transition precipitated a widespread ruralization of the Iberian economy, where the villa and the latifundia replaced the forum as the primary units of social and economic organization. Within these expansive estates, the potents, or local aristocrats, exercised quasi-judicial authority over a growing population of colony, or tenant farmers, who were legally tied to the land by imperial decree to ensure agricultural production. Simultaneously, the religious landscape was undergoing a profound transformation following the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, which established Nicene Christianity as the official state religion. The Council of Elvira, held earlier in the 4th century, had already begun the process of codifying Christian moral and social behavior, including the first formal ecclesiastical restrictions regarding interactions with the Jewish population. Despite the formal Christianization of the urban elite, significant portions of the rural population and the military remained influenced by diverse pagan traditions or the Priscillianist movement, a local ascetic sect that persisted despite official, imperial, and church condemnation. The legal framework of the Codex Theodosianus remained the theoretical basis for civil life, yet the practical enforcement of these laws became increasingly localized as the Comes Hispaniarum and the remaining limitanae, or border troops, lost their central funding and command structure. By the mid-5th century, the Iberian Peninsula had transformed into a fragmented mosaic where waning imperial influence and rising Germanic powers existed in a state of uneasy legalistic overlap. The presence of Jewish communities within the Iberian Peninsula long predates the Visigothic ascendancy, with historical roots intertwined with the maritime expansion of Phoenician and Carthaginian commercial networks. While medieval legends frequently cited the era of Solomon or the immediate aftermath of the Babylonian exile as the point of origin, archaeological data situates the first verifiable evidence within the context of the Roman early imperial period. Epigraphic findings provide the most concrete documentation of this early presence, such as the 3rd century trilingual inscription from Tarraco, or the funerary stelae found in Abdera, modern Adra, which utilized distinct Jewish nomenclature and symbols. These artifacts demonstrate that by the height of the Pax Romana, Jewish families were firmly established in the coastal emporia and inland administrative hubs like Augusta Emerita and Corduba. The legal status of these communities was defined by their standing as peregrini, or, after the Edict of Caracalla in 212, as full Roman citizens operating under the protection of a religio licita, which permitted the practice of ancestral customs and the internal governance of synagogues. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? Economic integration was primarily achieved through participation in the Mediterranean trade of high-value commodities, including the production and export of garum, the fermented fish sauce essential to Roman gastronomy, as well as the management of mining operations in the Sierra Morena and the textile trade in the Levant. Jewish merchants utilized the Via Augusta and the extensive maritime routes connecting Gades and Carthago Nova to the broader diaspora, facilitating a steady flow of cultural and intellectual exchange between Iberia, Rome, and Judea. The demographic density of these communities increased significantly following the Roman Jewish Wars of 70 and 135 AD, as the destruction of the Second Temple and the subsequent Bar Kokhba revolt triggered a westward displacement of captives and refugees across the Mediterranean provinces. These newcomers integrated into existing communal structures, bringing with them refined agricultural techniques in viticulture and olive cultivation that contributed to the economic vitality of provinces like Betica. The internal organization of these Iberian Jewish enclaves was modeled after the Hellenistic politeuma, governed by a council of elders and religious officials who administered communal justice according to the principles of the halacha, while remaining subject to Roman provincial law. This dual legal existence allowed for the maintenance of dietary laws, the Sabbath, and endogamous marriage practices within the framework of a highly pluralistic Roman society. Evidence from the necropolis of Elche and the synagogue ruins at Elche suggest a high degree of acculturation, where Jewish inhabitants adopted Roman architectural styles and Latin as a primary language of public discourse while retaining Hebrew or Aramaic for liturgical purposes. This stability was further bolstered by the institutionalization of the Patriarchate in Tiberias, which maintained links with the Iberian diaspora through the collection of the Aurum Coronarium tax. Consequently, by the dawn of late antiquity, the Jewish population was not a peripheral element, but a deeply embedded and prosperous component of the Iberian socio-economic fabric, possessing rights and property that would eventually become the target of shifting theological and political priorities in the centuries that followed. The migration of the Visigothic tribes into the Iberian Peninsula represented the final stage of a protracted territorial displacement that originated in the Baltic and Danubian regions. Following the collapse of the Kingdom of Toulouse in 507 AD, necessitated by the military triumph of the Franks at the Battle of Vouillé, the Gothic political center shifted definitively toward the south. This transition was characterized by the movement of an estimated 200,000 individuals organized as a gens, a tribal nation in arms, rather than a standard Roman military unit. The political framework of the Visigoths was rooted in the cipe, or extended kin group, which functioned as the primary mechanism for social cohesion and military mobilization. At the apex of this structure was the elected kingship, an institution that combined Germanic concepts of personal charisma and military success with the burgeoning influence of the Aula Regia, a consultative council of high-ranking nobles and palatine officials. Upon crossing the Pyrenees, the Visigoths established a system of land tenure distinct from previous Roman agrarian models. This was codified through the sorts Gothicae, the division of lands where Germanic settlers typically claimed two-thirds of the agricultural estates, leaving the remaining third to the Hispano-Roman possessores. This dual landholding system necessitated a complex legal and fiscal overlap, where the Saio, a Gothic judicial officer, worked alongside traditional Roman municipal authorities to manage disputes and oversee the collection of the fiscus, the royal tax revenue. The military organization of the migrants was predicated on the Theufa, a tactical unit of approximately 1,000 men commanded by a Theuphatus, which formed the backbone of the defensive garrisons established in strategic locations such as the Campi Gothorum in the northern Meseta. This Germanic warrior culture prioritized the comitatus, a bond of personal loyalty between the king and his bucellari, or private household troops, who were supported through direct land grants or stipends. This institutionalized militarism created a stark contrast with the established civilian-led administration of the Iberian Jewish and Roman populations. Social status among the Goths was signified through the Althing or assembly of free men, where matters of war, law, and succession were debated, maintaining a tradition of Germanic consensus building that initially operated independently of the Roman Senate's descendants. The Goths also brought with them the Morgengabe, or morning gift, and other distinctive marital laws that reinforced the ethnic boundaries between the incoming ruling class and the sedentary Iberian subjects. The arrival of the Visigoths did not immediately result in a unified state, but rather a series of military protectorates where the Gothic duces and comites oversaw the administration of provinces while remaining ethnically and legally segregated from the Romanized masses. The integration of the Goths into the Iberian landscape was further complicated by their retention of the Gothic language for internal tribal affairs and their adherence to a social hierarchy that valued genealogical descent from the Amals and Balthes lineages. This period of military occupation was managed through a pragmatic reliance on the existing Roman fiscal bureaucracy. Yet the cultural and political distance between the Germanic newcomers and the Jewish communities of the coastal cities remained pronounced as the Goths focused primarily on consolidating their rural military estates and securing the northern frontiers against Suebic and Frankish incursions. The religious landscape of the Visigothic kingdom during the 6th century was defined by the adherence of the Gothic ruling class to Arian Christianity, a Christological doctrine formulated by the 4th century Alexandrian priest Arius. This theological framework, which maintained that the Son was a created being subordinate to the Father, had been transmitted to the Goths via the missionary efforts of Wulfila during their residence in the Danubian basin. In the Iberian context, Arianism functioned as a primary marker of ethnic distinction, preserving the identity of the Gothic minority against the Nicene Catholic majority of the Hispano-Roman population. Because the Arian Church operated as a national institution exclusive to the Germanic elite, it lacked the universalist impulse to impose religious uniformity upon the diverse inhabitants of the peninsula. This ecclesiastical separation created a unique period of civil stability where the Jewish community was viewed primarily as a distinct fiscal and social category rather than a theological threat to the state. The structural tolerance of the Arian period was rooted in the pragmatic dualism of the Visigothic state, where two parallel religious hierarchies existed without a centralized mandate for synthesis. The Arian bishops, who utilized the Gothic language for liturgy and maintained their own churches and estates, did not compete for the same spiritual jurisdiction as the Nicene clergy or the Jewish rabbinical authorities. This lack of competition ensured that the restrictive anti-Jewish canons formulated by Nicene councils, such as those seen in the Eastern Empire or at Elvira, were rarely enforced by the Gothic kings. Historical records from the reigns of Euric and Alaric II indicate that Jewish subjects were permitted to maintain synagogues, celebrate religious festivals, and govern their internal affairs according to ancestral tradition. The secular authorities prioritized the stability of the tributum, or land, tax over the enforcement of religious orthodoxy, recognizing that the Jewish mercantile and agrarian classes provided essential revenue for the royal treasury. Furthermore, the Arian Goths perceived themselves as political and religious outsiders relative to the Roman Byzantine world, a perspective that fostered a tactical affinity with other non-Nicene groups. In an era where the Byzantine Emperor Justinian was actively persecuting nonconformists throughout the Mediterranean, the Visigothic peninsula served as a relative sanctuary. The theological distance between Arianism and Judaism, both of which emphasized a more rigid monotheism than the Nicene Trinitarian model, led to a reduction in the aggressive proselytism that characterized later centuries. Jewish communities maintained their positions in the municipal curiae and continued to own land, a status supported by the Gothic kings who viewed these subjects as reliable urban counterweights to the political ambitions of the Nicene Catholic aristocracy. This era of coexistence was characterized by the absence of state-sponsored religious violence, as the Arian establishment remained focused on maintaining its tribal exclusivity. While Jewish rights were legally bounded, they were not yet subject to the purity of blood or forced conversion edicts that would follow the political unification of the state and church. The Arian legacy thus provided a century-long buffer, during which the Jewish population expanded its economic influence and consolidated its cultural presence in cities like Narbonne and Toledo. This period remains a distinct historical phase where the Visigothic monarchy sought legitimacy through military strength and legal pluralism rather than the imposition of a singular faith, allowing for a multifaceted social order that would only be dismantled after the kingdom's formal conversion to the Nicene Creed. The promulgation of the Lex Romana Visigothorum, commonly referred to as the Breviary of Alaric in 506 AD, established the definitive legal framework for the non-Gothic inhabitants of the Iberian and Septimanian territories. Authorized by King Alaric II at Aduris, this legislative corpus was not a Germanic creation but a meticulous abridgment of existing Roman jurisprudence intended to consolidate the loyalty of the Gallo-Roman and Hispano-Roman provincial elites. The document relied heavily on the Codex Theodosianus, the Pauli Sententiae, and the works of Gaius, effectively preserving the sophisticated civil law of the late empire within a barbarian political structure. For the Jewish community, the breviary functioned as a dual-edged instrument. While it maintained several restrictive imperial decrees, it simultaneously provided a codified guarantee of civic status and religious protection that precluded arbitrary royal or local interference. Under the provisions of the breviary, the Jewish population remained subject to the Roman principle of personal law, which meant their legal rights and obligations were determined by their identity as Roman subjects rather than their proximity to Gothic tribal customs. The code explicitly protected the physical integrity of synagogues, prohibiting their destruction or the seizure of their properties for secular or ecclesiastical use. Furthermore, it recognized the internal judicial autonomy of Jewish communities, permitting rabbis and elders to adjudicate civil disputes and religious matters according to Jewish traditional law, provided these cases did not contravene the overarching interests of the state. This legal recognition allowed the Jewish minority to maintain a predictable social existence, governed by written statutes that were interpreted by professional Roman jurists rather than the Germanic military sciones. However, the breviary also institutionalized the social boundaries between the Jewish minority and the Christian majority by preserving specific Theodosian prohibitions. Jewish citizens were barred from holding administrative or military offices that would grant them authority over Christians, and the construction of new synagogues was forbidden, though the maintenance and repair of existing structures remained legal. The law also strictly prohibited proselytism, with severe penalties for any attempts to convert Christian subjects to Judaism. Despite these limitations, the breviary avoided the extreme penalties of later Visigothic law, such as the confiscation of property or the forced separation of families. Instead, it favored a system of fiscal and civic marginalization that allowed the community to remain an active and vital part of the urban economy. The enforcement of the breviary was entrusted to the comates civitatem, the city counts, who represented royal authority in the municipalities. These officials were instructed to apply the law as written in the commonitorium, the introductory directive accompanying the code, which emphasized that no other law or judicial precedent should be used in the courts. This insistence on legal exclusivity provided a period of institutional stability, as the Jewish community could rely on a static and documented set of rights. By validating these Roman statutes, Alaric II ensured that the Jewish population possessed a recognized place within the Gothic social hierarchy, shielded by a legal tradition that valued precedent and property rights. This legislative stability would remain the cornerstone of Jewish life in Hispania for the duration of the Aryan period, only coming under systematic assault when the kingdom eventually abandoned the principle of legal pluralism in favor of religious and territorial uniformity. Toledo, designated as the Urbs Regia, or Royal City, functioned as the administrative and economic nerve center of the Visigothic state by the mid-6th century. Its strategic position on the Tajo River allowed it to dominate the trans-peninsular trade routes, facilitating a robust urban revival that relied heavily on the specialized skills of its Jewish inhabitants. Archaeological evidence and contemporary legal documents indicate that the Jewish population was concentrated in specific quarters, likely near the southern fortifications and the commercial gates, where they operated as a distinct and protected socio-economic class. This community was instrumental in the revitalization of professional guilds, or collegia, particularly those involved in high-value metallurgical production and textile manufacturing. Jewish goldsmiths and silversmiths, utilizing techniques of cloisonne and granulation, produced the elaborate regalia and votive crowns required by the Gothic court, bridging the gap between Roman decorative traditions and Germanic aesthetic preferences. In the commercial sphere, Jewish merchants acted as primary agents in the distribution of imported Mediterranean commodities, including Tyrian purple dyes, Levantine glassware, and Eastern spices. These long-distance trade operations were supported by a network of credit and maritime contracts that connected Toledo to the Byzantine-held ports of the Levant and the North African coast. Beyond the city walls, the economic influence of the community extended into the rural hinterland through the ownership of productive villas and specialized agrarian estates. These landholdings focused on the intensive cultivation of viticulture and the production of olive oil for export, managed through a system of irrigation and terracing that preserved late Roman hydraulic expertise. The legal protection afforded to these property rights under the existing Gothic framework ensured a continuous flow of agrarian surplus into the urban markets, stabilizing the regional economy during periods of central political transition. The fiscal contributions of the Toledo Jewish community were essential to the maintenance of the royal fiscus. Unlike the Gothic military elite, who were often exempt from certain forms of direct taxation in exchange for military service, Jewish subjects were a primary source of liquid capital for the crown. They paid the capitatio, or head tax, and the canonicum, a regular contribution that funded the increasingly complex Palatine bureaucracy. This financial utility provided the community with significant leverage at court, as the kings recognized that the expulsion or excessive persecution of these urban taxpayers would precipitate a collapse in the treasury's ability to pay the stipendium for the standing army. Consequently, Jewish financiers often served as middlemen in the collection of provincial taxes, utilizing their literate and professionalized networks to manage the complex accounting required by the comes patrimony. The marketplace of Toledo thus became a site of functional intersection, where the Germanic warrior class, the Hispano-Roman clergy, and Jewish commercial agents interacted within a strictly defined legal hierarchy. This economic interdependence fostered a degree of social stability that characterized the city before the era of forced religious uniformity. The presence of specialized Jewish quarters provided the urban fabric with its essential craft infrastructure, from the tanning of high-quality Cordoban leathers to the minting of the triens, the standard Visigothic gold coin. This period of urban prosperity was predicated on a model of pluralism where professional utility was valued over theological purity, creating a capital city that was as much a center of international commerce as it was a fortress of Gothic political power. The reign of Leovigild, spanning from 568 to 586 AD, represented the most vigorous period of monarchical consolidation in the history of the Visigothic state. Recognizing the administrative deficiencies of a fractured peninsula, Leovigild initiated a series of reforms designed to elevate the crown above tribal factionalism and provincial descent. He was the first Gothic ruler to adopt the full regalia of Byzantine emperors, utilizing the throne, the purple robe, and the scepter to project a new, centralized majesty that transcended the traditional Germanic role of a mere war leader. Central to his vision of a unified Regnum Gotharum was the military subjugation of peripheral territories, a campaign that resulted in the definitive annexation of the Suebic kingdom in the northwest and the reduction of the Byzantine province of Hispania to a handful of coastal enclaves. This territorial expansion was accompanied by the systematic establishment of new urban centers such as Recapolis and Victoriacum, which served as administrative anchors for the royal bureaucracy. Legal reform served as a primary tool for social engineering during this era. Leovigild promulgated the Codex Revisus, a substantial revision of the earlier Gothic law codes that addressed the evolving needs of a sedentary, integrated population. The most consequential provision of this new legislation was the formal repeal of the long-standing Roman and Germanic prohibitions against intermarriage between Goths and Romans. By removing this legal barrier, Leovigild facilitated the emergence of a unified landed aristocracy, effectively merging the Gothic military elite with the Hispano-Roman senatorial class. This policy of ethnic fusion was intended to create a singular, loyal subject base that would support the fiscal and military requirements of the crown. In this environment, the Jewish population occupied a stable, if strictly defined, position. Leovigild maintained a pragmatic relationship with Jewish merchants and financiers, valuing their role in the state's economic infrastructure as he sought to fund his continuous military expeditions. Religious policy under Leovigild was characterized by an attempt to reach a compromise that would preserve Aryanism while making it more palatable to the Nicene Catholic majority. At the Arian Synod of Toledo in 580 AD, he attempted to simplify the conversion process for Nicene Christians by removing the requirement for rebaptism, suggesting instead a simple laying on of hands. This pan-Arian initiative was not a move toward religious pluralism, but a calculated effort to achieve a single national church under royal control. However, this policy precipitated a violent internal crisis when his son, Hermenegild, converted to Nicene Catholicism and launched a protracted rebellion supported by the Suebi and the Byzantines. The civil war that followed forced Leovigild to intensify his military centralization, leading to the eventual execution of his son and the temporary suppression of the Catholic opposition. Throughout these political and military upheavals, Leovigild's stance toward the Jewish community remained dictated by state utility. He did not introduce the systemic theological persecution that would characterize the succeeding century. Rather, he prioritized the collection of the aurum coronarium and other mercantile levies to sustain the officium palatinum. Jewish landowners continued to manage their estates under the protections of the civil statutes Leovigild had preserved. This reign marked the final equilibrium of the Aryan era, where the monarchy sought political and territorial totality through legal and military reform, yet stopped short of demanding the spiritual uniformity that would eventually dismantle the kingdom's social pluralism. By the time of his death in 586, Leovigild had bequeathed his successor a peninsula that was geographically united but religiously divided, a tension that would soon be resolved through a dramatic and permanent shift in the state's ideological foundation. The Third Council of Toledo, convened in May 589 AD, fundamentally reoriented the ideological and institutional foundations of the Visigothic state. Under the direction of King Recared, the assembly formalized the transition of the Gothic ruling class from Aryanism to Nicene Catholicism, effectively ending the century-long religious duality that had defined the kingdom. This synod was attended by 72 bishops from across the Iberian Peninsula and Septimania, representing a unified ecclesiastical body that now served as the primary legislative partner to the monarchy. The theological pivot was articulated through the formal recitation of the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, including the significant addition of the Filioque clause, a move designed to distinguish the newly Orthodox Gothic Church from its Eastern Byzantine counterparts. This transition was not merely a spiritual event, but a strategic integration of the Germanic military elite with the Hispano-Roman ecclesiastical hierarchy, creating a sacred monarchy where the king's legitimacy was increasingly tied to his role as the defender of the faith. The council established the Concilia Toledana as a permanent consultative mechanism, where the high clergy and the virilusters of the Palatine office met to draft canons that carried the weight of civil law. This institutional synergy meant that the king's decrees were now bolstered by the moral authority and administrative reach of the Catholic Church. Among the 23 canons promulgated at the council, several specifically targeted the legal status of the Jewish community, marking the first systemic erosion of the protections previously afforded by the Breviary of Alaric. Canon 14 of the Council's Acts explicitly prohibited Jews from marrying Christian women, purchasing Christian slaves, or holding public offices that exerted judicial authority over Christians. These measures were intended to enforce a strict social hierarchy where the non-Christian population was systematically excluded from the levers of political and economic power. Furthermore, the Third Council introduced the concept of the Unio Christiana, an ideological mandate for a singular, uniform belief system within the territorial boundaries of the kingdom. This nascent nationalism viewed religious nonconformity as a form of political sedition, a perspective that placed the Jewish minority under heightened state surveillance. The council also mandated that children born of mixed marriages, legalized earlier by Leovigild, must be baptized and raised as Christians, effectively attempting to liquidate the Jewish presence through generational assimilation. The fiscal administration of the Jewish community was also impacted, as the Church began to claim a portion of the mercantile levies and land taxes previously reserved for the royal fiscus. This period witnessed the emergence of a legislative interdependence between the secular and religious spheres, where the king confirmed the council's canons via royal lex, making ecclesiastical infractions punishable by the state. The transition marked the end of the Gothic tribal exclusivity that had characterized the Aryan era, replacing it with a theo-political model that sought the total spiritual and civic integration of the peninsula's inhabitants. By the conclusion of the 589 Synod, the legal pluralism that had allowed Jewish communities to function as autonomous entities was replaced by a restrictive framework that prioritized the purity of the Catholic res publica. This structural shift laid the groundwork for the more aggressive exclusionary policies of the 7th century. As the Visigothic state increasingly defined its identity through the marginalization of those who remained outside the newly established Orthodox fold. The ideological maturation of the Visigothic state following the events of 589 AD catalyzed the emergence of a proto-national identity termed Gothia. This conceptual shift involved the deliberate fusion of Gothic martial traditions with the Roman heritage of territorial administration and the moral authority of Catholic orthodoxy. The Palatine elite and the higher clergy collaborated to construct a new historical narrative, primarily disseminated through the Laus Spaniae, which portrayed the Iberian Peninsula as a sacred, unified entity under the exclusive stewardship of the Goths. In this revised historiography, the Gothic people were no longer portrayed as nomadic conquerors or a segregated military caste, but as the legitimate successors to the Roman emperors, chosen by divine providence to safeguard the peninsula from both external Byzantine encroachment and internal religious deviance. This nascent nationalism transformed the role of the king into a rex sacerdos, whose primary duty was the maintenance of the pax religiosa, a state of communal harmony achieved through strict adherence to a single creed. The consolidation of Gothia necessitated the marginalization of any social or religious groups that existed outside this Romano-Gothic Catholic synthesis. The previous model of legal pluralism, which had accommodated the Jewish population as a protected fiscal category, was now viewed as an impediment to the total integration of the patria. Legal documents from this period began to utilize the term religio externa to describe Jewish practices, effectively reclassifying an indigenous population as an alien element within the body politic. The state began to prioritize the integritas of the Christian community, viewing the presence of non-conforming religious rituals as a source of spiritual contagion that threatened the stability of the realm. This shift was reflected in the increasing use of the term Judae as a derogatory legal label in royal edicts, stripping away the civic nuances that had previously defined the community's status. Institutional support for this new identity was provided by the development of a unified educational curriculum in the Episcopal schools of Seville and Zaragoza, where the study of Latin rhetoric and Roman law was repositioned to serve the interests of the Gothic monarchy. This intellectual climate fostered a culture of suspicion toward those who maintained a separate linguistic or liturgical tradition. The Gothia project sought to eliminate the last vestiges of the dual state by enforcing a singular judicial standard across all provinces, a process that inherently disadvantaged the Jewish community by removing the local protections they had negotiated with previous Aryan administrations. The monarchy's reliance on the Church for administrative legitimacy gave the bishops significant influence over social policy, leading to the characterization of religious nonconformity as a form of latent treason against the regnum. Consequently, by the early 7th century, the Iberian Jewish community found itself in an increasingly precarious position as the state's definition of belonging moved from political loyalty to spiritual uniformity. The emerging concept of Gothia did not merely describe a geographical reality, but a theological and ethnic ideal that required the exclusion of those who could not be fully subsumed into the Catholic Gothic identity. This era marked the transition from a society of negotiated differences to one of enforced sameness, where the Gothic peace was predicated on the systematic erasure of pluralism. As the state intensified its pursuit of a unified gens Gothorum, the legal and social boundaries surrounding the Jewish population became more rigid, setting the stage for the definitive legislative confrontations that would occur during the reign of Sisebut. The legislative implementation of King Recared's religious transition transformed the theoretical canons of the Third Council into a series of enforceable royal edicts that directly targeted the socio-economic foundations of the Jewish community. These initial restrictions focused heavily on the prohibition of Jewish ownership of Christian slaves, a policy that disrupted the traditional labor structures of the late antique Iberian economy. Under Roman law, the right to own slaves was an essential component of property rights and agricultural management, but the new Visigothic legislation reclassified this right through the lens of spiritual jurisdiction. The state mandated that any Christian slave held by a Jewish master must be manumitted or sold to a Christian buyer, often at a fixed price that disadvantaged the original owner. This measure effectively stripped Jewish landowners of the workforce necessary to maintain large-scale estates, forcing a significant contraction in the productivity of viticulture and grain operations in the southern provinces. The legal marginalization of the community was further institutionalized through the systematic exclusion of Jewish citizens from the curia, the municipal councils responsible for local governance and tax collection. This prohibition removed the Jewish elite from the administrative life of the city, a sphere where they had historically exerted considerable influence as decuriones. By barring them from public office, the crown ensured that the local judiciary and fiscal administration were composed entirely of the Catholic aristocracy, thereby eliminating the legal recourse previously available to Jewish defendants in municipal courts. This shift was accompanied by the introduction of the testimonium restriction, which devalued Jewish testimony in legal disputes involving Christians, creating a fundamental imbalance in the application of civil justice. Beyond labor and administration, Recared's policies targeted the symbolic and social integration of the community through the enforcement of endogamy laws. The prohibition of intermarriage was now policed by ecclesiastical observers who reported infractions to the city counts, often resulting in the forced separation of spouses and the confiscation of their shared assets. These laws were designed to prevent the contamination of the Christian flock, a concept that had no equivalent in the pragmatic Aryan period. The state also began to interfere with the physical manifestations of Jewish presence placing strict limits on the public performance of religious ceremonies and enforcing the Sabbath as a day of compulsory Christian observance for all subjects, regardless of their faith. The enforcement of these decrees was overseen by the Eutyches, local judges who were now accountable to the provincial bishops for the religious purity of their jurisdictions. This institutionalized oversight meant that legal disputes were increasingly adjudicated based on canonical priorities rather than the secular precedents of the Breviary of Alaric. While these early measures did not yet demand the total erasure of the Jewish population, they succeeded in dismantling the social contracts that had allowed for shared civic participation. By the end of Recared's reign, the Jewish community had transitioned from a group of integrated citizens to a marginalized caste, legally isolated from the political and economic heart of the kingdom. This period of fraying threads provided the bureaucratic and ideological template for the more comprehensive expulsions that would be enacted in the coming decades. The early 7th century witnessed the intellectual consolidation of the Visigothic Church through the leadership of the metropolitan bishops, most notably Isidor of Seville, who succeeded his brother Leander in the See of Hispalis around 600 AD. This era was defined by a massive encyclopedic project aimed at systematizing the totality of classical and Christian knowledge to provide a stable foundation for the unified state. Isidor's monumental work, the Etymologiae, served as the definitive scholarly repository for the Latin West, recontextualizing Roman liberal arts within a strictly Catholic framework. Through his prolific literary output, including the Sententiae and the De Fide Catholica contra Judaios, Isidor developed a sophisticated theological justification for a monolithic Christian society. His writing moved beyond the reactive canons of previous councils to establish a proactive ideology where the health of the patria was inextricably linked to the dogmatic purity of its inhabitants. Central to this intellectual climate was the belief that the Visigothic kings were successors to the biblical kings of Judah, tasked with maintaining a new Israel on the Iberian Peninsula. This typology shifted the monarch's responsibility from simple territorial defense to the proactive eradication of religious dissent. The episcopal elite drafted the theoretical framework for the Officium Palatinum, asserting that the secular arm of the state must serve as the instrument of ecclesiastical discipline. This synergy was codified in the Collectio Canonum Hispana, a systematic compilation of conciliar acts and papal decretals that became the standard for Spanish canon law. In this legal and theological environment, the Jewish population was categorized as a vestige of an obsolete era, whose continued existence in an unbaptized state was viewed as an affront to the teleological mission of the Gothic kingdom. Isidor's history of the Goths finalized the transition of the Germanic tribes into a divinely ordained ruling class. By emphasizing the victory of the Goths over the Roman Aryan past, he legitimized the monarchy's authority to override ancient civil protections in favor of new religious mandates. The intellectual climate of Seville and Toledo encouraged a form of scholarly polemic that characterized the Jewish diaspora as a perpetual stranger within the Christian commonwealth. This academic hostility provided the necessary pretext for King Sisebut's subsequent administrative actions, as the bishops argued that the king's salvation depended upon the conversion of his non-Christian subjects. The clergy utilized the pulpit and the classroom to disseminate the idea that the Jewish presence was a source of ritual pollution, a concept that fundamentally undermined the previous centuries of pragmatic coexistence. This period of clerical rise also saw the institutionalization of the schola in every bishopric, ensuring that the next generation of Gothic administrators was thoroughly indoctrinated in the principles of religious totality. The curriculum focused on the Vetus Latina and the writings of the Church Fathers, which were interpreted to emphasize the necessity of a singular, state-mandated faith. By providing the crown with a coherent, scholarly, and divinely sanctioned worldview, the bishops of the Isidorian circle transformed the Visigothic monarchy into an ideological engine. This intellectual infrastructure was the essential prerequisite for the 612 expulsion, as it supplied the legal definitions, historical narratives, and moral imperatives that King Sisebut would eventually translate into the definitive decree of forced conversion. The southern province of Betica, renowned for its fertile soils and strategic river systems, remained the center of Jewish agricultural activity as the Visigothic kingdom matured. Unlike the aristocratic Gothic Theophadus, who focused on military administration, Jewish rural life was anchored in the fundus, or agricultural estate, where multi-generational ties to the land dictated daily existence. These agrarian communities were not merely transient occupants, but were essential to the continuity of the Iberian olive and wine economies. Archaeological surveys of rural sites near the Guadalquivir River reveal a complex system of production where Jewish freeholders and tenants utilized specialized pressing equipment for oleum and vinum, maintaining the technical standards of the Roman villa system, while adapting to the increasingly localized Gothic economy. In this rural context, the Jewish population engaged in the intensive cultivation of industrial crops, such as flax and esparto grass, which were critical for the regional cordage and textile industries. The management of these estates required a sophisticated understanding of the perienosis, the seasonal cycle of planting and harvesting, which was often synchronized with traditional lunar calendars. This deep integration into the landscape was further evidenced by the ownership of horti, or irrigated gardens, which produced a variety of legumes and fruits that supplemented the urban food supply of nearby centers like Cordoba and Hispalis. The agrarian expertise of these Jewish laborers allowed them to maintain a degree of economic self-sufficiency that was less susceptible to the immediate fluctuations of Palatine politics compared to their urban counterparts. The socio-economic fabric of these estates was held together by the Paroesia, a local rural organization that facilitated the sharing of resources such as draft animals, irrigation rights, and storage facilities. While the state viewed the Jewish presence through a theological lens, the rural reality was one of profound attachment to the physical geography of the peninsula. Legal documents from the early 7th century increasingly mention the vicini, or neighbors, indicating that Jewish farmers lived in close proximity to their Christian and Gothic peers, sharing the common burden of the jugatio, the tax on land and labor. This shared agricultural reality created a layer of social permanence that the burgeoning anti-Jewish legislation sought to disrupt by targeting the labor pool. The legal assault on Jewish slave ownership struck directly at the viability of these rural holdings. Because the colony and slaves were the primary engine of agrarian surplus, the mandated manumission of Christian laborers forced many Jewish farmers into a state of precariousness. However, the depth of their roots in the soil meant that rather than abandoning their lands, many communities intensified their reliance on family labor and local mutual aid networks. This persistence in the face of economic disenfranchisement demonstrated that the Jewish identity in Iberia was as much about the stewardship of the land as it was about the adherence to religious ritual. By 612, the agrarian roots of the Betican Jewish communities were so deeply entrenched that the expulsion decree was not merely a movement of people, but a fundamental tearing of the Iberian agricultural fabric, leaving vast tracts of land untended and traditional expertise lost to the state. The assassination of Leovigild in 603 AD marked a violent rupture in the dynastic continuity established by Recared and signaled a significant, albeit temporary, decentralization of the Visigothic political apparatus. Witeric, a seasoned military commander who had previously participated in the Aryan conspiracies during the reign of Leovigild, seized the throne through a palace coup supported by a faction of the Gothic nobility that remained wary of the growing ecclesiastical hegemony. His elevation to the kingship represented a strategic pivot away from the theocratic governance favored by the Toledan councils toward a more traditional militaristic model of Germanic sovereignty. While Witeric nominally maintained the Catholic faith for diplomatic expediency, his administration was characterized by a distinct lack of cooperation with the metropolitan bishops, effectively stalling the legislative momentum of the sacred monarchy, and providing an unplanned hiatus in the systematic implementation of exclusionary religious policies. During this 7-year reign, the Palatine bureaucracy's focus shifted from theological unification to territorial defense and foreign policy. Witeric's primary objective was the containment of the Byzantine presence in Hispania, leading to a series of military campaigns that culminated in the capture of several coastal strongholds, including the strategic port of Saguntum. To bolster the kingdom's international standing, he attempted to forge a quadruple alliance involving the Visigoths, the Lombards, and the Frankish kingdoms of Austrasia and Burgundy. Although this grand diplomatic maneuver ultimately failed due to the internal instabilities of the Merovingian courts, the effort required a pragmatic domestic policy that prioritized social stability and fiscal solvency over the enforcement of religious orthodoxy. Consequently, the restrictive canons of 589 were largely unenforced at the local level, as the king relied on the logistical expertise and liquid capital of the Jewish and Romanized mercantile classes to fund his professionalized comitatus. The political climate of Witeric's reign was defined by the fragility of the Toledan synthesis. Without the active sponsorship of the monarch, the episcopal elite found their administrative reach limited to purely liturgical and internal church matters. Historical chronicles from this period, such as those later compiled by Isidor, remain notably terse regarding Witeric's achievements, often portraying his rule as an era of moral laxity and secular preoccupation. This clerical silence reflects the regime's refusal to utilize the state's coercive power to pursue the purification of the realm. For the Jewish community in Betica and Carthaginensis, this era functioned as a brief respite, where the immediate threat of property confiscation and forced manumission of labor was superseded by the state's need for agricultural productivity and tax revenue during a time of constant military mobilization. However, the lack of institutional support for Witeric's secularized rule eventually led to his downfall. In 610 AD, he was assassinated during a banquet by a conspiracy of nobles led by Gundamar, a move that was immediately endorsed by the Catholic clergy who sought to restore the partnership between the altar and the throne. The transition from Witeric to Gundamar signaled the definitive end of the Arian reaction and the reestablishment of the Council of Toledo as the primary legislative engine of the state. This brief respite had demonstrated the fragility of the new Catholic order when stripped of royal patronage, yet its conclusion ensured that the next phase of Visigothic history would be characterized by an intensified and more legally sophisticated assault on religious pluralism. The political vacuum left by Witeric's death was rapidly filled by a resurgent episcopal royal alliance, setting the stage for the Ascension of Sisebut and the final legal path toward the 612 expulsion. The election of Sisebut to the Visigothic throne in 612 AD marked the transition from a period of political drift to one of intellectualized religious absolutism. Unlike his predecessors, who were primarily career military commanders, Sisebut was a prominent figure within the Isidorian literary circle, possessing a sophisticated education in Latin grammar, rhetoric, and astronomy. His extant works, which include a hagiography of Saint Desiderius and a hexameter poem on lunar eclipses, reveal a monarch who viewed himself as a philosopher, king responsible for the cosmic and spiritual order of the Regnum Gotharum. This intellectual background fostered a distinct administrative style in which royal authority was justified not merely through martial victory, but through the fulfillment of a theological mission. Sisebut's ascension effectively institutionalized the sacred monarchy, as he sought to align the legal mechanisms of the state with the providential historical narrative developed by the episcopal elite. The administrative center in Toledo under Sisebut became a venue for intense legislative activity directed toward the homogenization of the Iberian population. The king maintained a prolific correspondence with Byzantine officials and Frankish rulers, utilizing a high-style Latinity to project an image of the Visigothic state as a beacon of orthodox stability. His personal religious fervor was characterized by an eschatological urgency. He believed that the persistence of non-believers within the kingdom was a direct impediment to divine favor and a potential cause for national catastrophe. This worldview fundamentally altered the nature of the Aula Regia, which increasingly functioned as a theological tribunal where the king and his Palatine officials debated the mechanics of ritual purification. Sisebut's rule was defined by the conviction that the correctio, the correction of the people's faith, was the primary function of his office, a duty that superseded the traditional Roman and Gothic precedents of legal pluralism. The king's military campaigns against the Byzantines in the south were framed as holy wars designed to reclaim the peninsula for the true faith, further intertwining territorial expansion with religious crusade. His success in capturing several maritime outposts from the Eastern Empire provided him with the political capital necessary to enforce radical internal reforms without fear of aristocratic rebellion. Sisebut's governance introduced a system of compulsory piety, where the king directly intervened in ecclesiastical appointments to ensure that the bishops shared his vision of a monolithic Christian society. This centralization of power eliminated the regional autonomy that had previously allowed local counts to negotiate their own relationships with non-conforming religious groups. By 612, the scholarly and theocratic tendencies of Sisebut's reign converged to create the legal momentum required for the first kingdom-wide decree of forced baptism. He rejected the more moderate cautionary advice of contemporary theologians who questioned the efficacy of coerced conversion, arguing instead that the king possessed the sovereign right to determine the religious status of his subjects for the sake of the common good. His ascension thus finalized the transformation of the Visigothic monarch from a tribal leader into an ideological autocrat. The intellectual infrastructure of the Isidorian Renaissance provided Sisebut with the tools to redefine the law as a medium for spiritual coercion, setting the stage for an edict that would formally terminate the ancient Jewish presence in Iberia through the unprecedented application of state-mandated ritual. The theological discourse of the Sisebutian era was characterized by a synthesis of biblical exegesis and political urgency, where the presence of an unbaptized Jewish community was framed as a structural impediment to divine favor. The correspondence of Sisebut and the contemporary episcopal elite utilized the concept of the populus infidelis to argue that the spiritual hygiene of the regnum Gothorum was the primary determinant of national security. This rationale was built upon the interpretation of recent natural and military crises, including seismic events, recurring pestilence, and the persistent Byzantine threat, as manifestations of ira Dei, or divine wrath, triggered by the continued toleration of religious nonconformity. The prevailing argument suggested that a king who failed to purge his realm of infidelity risked the same providential abandonment that had famously led to the fall of the biblical Judean kings. This intellectual climate introduced the doctrine of compulsio ad fidem, or the necessity of coerced faith for the preservation of the common good. Sisebut's court relied on the letters of the early church fathers, specifically the later works of Augustine regarding the Donatists, to justify the state's use of force as a form of pastoral medicine intended to save souls through the discipline of the law. This theological posture reclassified the refusal of baptism as a form of spiritual treason, shifting the debate from individual conscience to the collective salvation of the gens Gothorum. Episcopal writings of this period, often intended for use in the Officium Palatinum, argued that the Jewish rejection of Christological dogma acted as a constant internal subversion of the state's sacred mission, necessitating a definitive choice between integration via the sacrament or total removal from the territory. The rhetoric of the period also emphasized the necessity of achieving a singular cor unum et anima una, one heart and one soul, across the entire Iberian population. This ideal of spiritual totality viewed the Jewish community's adherence to the Old Law not as an ancestral right, but as an active denial of the fulfillment of history, as represented by the Visigothic Catholic monarchy. The state-sponsored polemics of the 610s asserted that the Goths had inherited the covenantal status of the chosen people, a status that required the absolute exclusion of competing claims to truth. This exclusionary theology was reinforced by the idea of perfidia, a term utilized in royal and ecclesiastical documents to denote a willful and malicious blindness that supposedly made the Jewish population a latent fifth column within the kingdom. By 612, these arguments had coalesced into a formal ideological mandate that left no room for the legal pluralism of the previous century. The theological rationale for expulsion was predicated on the belief that the king possessed a divine obligation to purify the land, to ensure the continued prosperity and military success of the realm. This framework eliminated the traditional Roman concepts of civic protection, replacing them with a mandate of spiritual homogenization that justified the 612 edict as an act of pious necessity. Consequently, the expulsion was presented not as an act of secular persecution, but as a ritualistic restoration of order, intended to align the physical boundaries of the kingdom with the spiritual boundaries of the Catholic Church. The formal enactment of the 612 expulsion decree by King Sisebut represented a definitive departure from the tradition of Roman and Germanic legislative compromise, replacing it with the principle of religious totality. The edict, known to historians through its preserved fragments in the later Lex Visigothorum, was drafted as a comprehensive royal constitution designed to eliminate the legal and religious ambiguity of the Jewish status. This law presented the Jewish population with a rigid, non-negotiable ultimatum. They were required to submit to the baptismal font within a specific time frame, or undergo total expulsion from the territories of the Visigothic kingdom. Unlike previous restrictive measures that sought to marginalize the community, this legislation aimed at its complete erasure, treating the refusal to convert as a capital offense against the state. The drafting process involved the royal chancery and the Palatine secretaries, who utilized a highly formalized legal language to frame the decree as a necessary act of royal piety and administrative order. The decree introduced the legal mechanism of confiscatio, whereby the assets and estates of those who chose exile were automatically transferred to the royal fiscus, or granted to the Catholic Church. This fiscal component was essential to the law's enforcement, as it provided a financial incentive for local officials to ensure compliance. The law also stipulated that any individual who accepted baptism but was later discovered practicing Jewish rites would be subject to even more severe penalties, including enslavement or death, thereby establishing the legal foundation for the Inquisition of converts. By making the sacrament of baptism a prerequisite for legal existence, Sisebut effectively stripped the Jewish community of their standing as civs, or citizens, reducing their identity to a theological category that the state was mandated to resolve. This legislation was not merely a local ordinance, but was distributed through the conventus system to every provincial governor, ensuring that the mandate reached the furthest coastal regions and rural districts of the peninsula. The language of the edict characterized the act of expulsion as a cleansing of the land, utilizing the term eradicatio to describe the intended outcome for the Jewish faith in Hispania. It specifically targeted the ancilla, or the servant class, and the domini, the masters, ensuring that no level of the social hierarchy was exempt from the choice. To prevent evasion, the law mandated that all public transactions and legal contracts involving Jews must be ceased until their religious status was verified through a certificate of baptism issued by a local bishop. This effectively froze the economic life of the community, making daily survival nearly impossible for those who did not immediately comply. The state also prohibited any Christian subject from providing shelter or assistance to those who chose exile, criminalizing the act of communal solidarity. The promulgation of the 612 Edict thus marked the end of the negotiated pluralism that had characterized the Iberian Peninsula since the Roman era. By centralizing the authority to define religious identity within the crown, Sisebut created a precedent where the law was no longer a tool for mediating between different groups, but an instrument for the forced integration of a single national identity. The decree's uncompromising nature left no room for the internal judicial autonomy that had previously been the cornerstone of Jewish life, signaling a new era of state-sponsored religious absolutism. The administrative machinery of the Gothic kingdom was now fully committed to the logistical challenge of either absorbing or removing an entire segment of its population, setting in motion a period of profound social upheaval and demographic displacement. The implementation of Sisebut's 612 decree included a designated period of transition, a 12-month interval of legal and social suspension intended to facilitate the total liquidation of Jewish civil identity. This chronological window was not an act of leniency, but a pragmatic administrative necessity to manage the massive transfer of assets and the restructuring of the provincial labor force. During this year, the Jewish population was required to finalize all pending litigation and settle outstanding debts, as their standing to appear in court or enter into binding contracts would terminate upon the edict's deadline. This period of grace triggered a profound destabilization of the land market. Jewish property owners facing imminent exile or forced conversion were compelled to liquidate ancestral estates and urban residences in a buyer's market dominated by the Catholic nobility and the ecclesiastical authorities. The logistical burden of the ultimatum necessitated a comprehensive inventory of all Jewish-owned property, conducted by the comites and the local curiales under the supervision of the bishops. Legal records indicate that many Jewish families attempted to preserve their wealth by transferring titles to Christian neighbors or Gothic allies through fideicommissum, a trust based on good faith. Yet these maneuvers were frequently invalidated by royal investigators who viewed such transactions as fraudulent attempts to circumvent the confiscatio. The economic impact was particularly acute in the commercial hubs of the Mediterranean coast, where the sudden withdrawal of Jewish liquid capital and the cessation of credit operations led to a contraction in long-distance trade. Families were forced to prioritize which portable assets could be carried into exile, often abandoning heavy agricultural equipment, libraries, and industrial tools that had sustained their livelihoods for generations. Simultaneously, the ultimatum forced a definitive resolution regarding the status of the family, or household dependents. Because the law strictly prohibited the departure of any Christian-born slaves or servants under Jewish ownership, families choosing exile were forced to sever ties with dependents who had often been integrated into their domestic structures for decades. This forced manumission was accompanied by a prohibition on the removal of children who had already been subject to the baptismal mandates of previous councils, effectively using the threat of permanent family separation as a primary tool of state coercion. The administrative machinery of the Officium Palatinum, utilized this year to issue standardized travel permits for those opting for expulsion, ensuring that the movement of refugees was channeled through specific ports and mountain passes where they could be monitored and taxed one final time. By the midpoint of this 12-month period, the social fabric of the Jewish quarters in cities like Merida and Tarraco had largely unraveled. The suspension of public worship in synagogues and the legal freezing of communal funds meant that the institutional support structures of the diaspora were dismantled before the final deadline. The ultimatum created a climate of profound uncertainty as individuals weighed the preservation of their religious integrity against the total loss of their socio-economic standing and the potential fragmentation of their kin groups. This period of transition finalized the transition of the Jewish community from a foundational element of Iberian society into a marginalized group of transient subjects, preparing the way for the ritualistic mass conversions or the physical departure that would mark the conclusion of the 612 mandate. The binary ultimatum of 612 AD, presenting the choice between conversion and exilium, introduced a terminal crisis for the Jewish population that was navigated through the specific legal and social constraints of Visigothic kinship. In the context of early 7th century Hispania, the concept of the patria had evolved from a Roman administrative region into a sacred Gothic territory where residency was increasingly contingent upon sacramental participation. For families rooted in the peninsula since the late Republic, the prospect of exile involved the forfeiture of not only tangible assets, but also the protection of the lex terrae, the law of the land, which did not extend beyond the kingdom's frontiers. This created a profound sociological tension where the preservation of religious identity stood in direct opposition to the preservation of the cognatio, or the extended family unit, which was the primary source of security and status in the post-Roman world. The state exacerbated this crisis by implementing the caesura familiaris, a legal strategy that prevented households from departing as a single entity. Because children who had been previously baptized under earlier, less comprehensive decrees were classified as property of the church, parents opting for exile were legally barred from taking their offspring with them. This separation was enforced by the vilici and local clergy, who were mandated to ensure that the next generation remained within the Gothic fold. Consequently, the decision to leave was often a decision to accept the permanent fragmentation of the lineage. Those who chose the baptismal font, conversely, entered a state of legal surveillance where their sinceritas, or the perceived honesty of their conversion, was subject to constant evaluation by Palatine officials. This choice led to the emergence of a clandestine religious life, where the outward performance of Catholic ritual was utilized to secure the legal right to remain on ancestral lands. The debate within the community was further complicated by the lack of immediate geographic alternatives. While North Africa and parts of Gaul offered temporary refuge, the rising tide of religious uniformity across the former western provinces suggested that exile might only be a temporary delay of a similar fate. The internal disputatio among Jewish elders often weighed the pikuach nefesh, the principle of preserving life, against the requirements of the halacha, leading to divergent communal responses. In urban centers like Emerita, some segments of the community sought to utilize their remaining liquid wealth to bribe local committees for exit visas or stay of execution orders, while others focused on the preservation of sacred texts and ritual objects through burial or concealment in hidden caches. By the time the 12-month period concluded, the demographic landscape of the Jewish quarters was defined by this forced divergence. The state's insistence on a singular religious identity had succeeded in turning the domestic sphere into a site of judicial inquiry. The choice was never framed by the Sisebutian court as an exercise in free will, but as a mandatory alignment with the utilitas publica, the public utility of the state. Those who remained as conversos were legally redefined as new Christians, a category that carried its own set of restrictive obligations and suspicions, while those who departed were erased from the official census, their physical absence serving as the final confirmation of their exclusion from the newly defined Gothic nation. The Mass, conversion ceremonies of 612 AD, were conducted as highly orchestrated state rituals, intended to provide the theological and legal confirmation of Sisebut's edict. In the principal metropolitan cathedrals, most notably the Basilica of Santa Maria in Toledo and the great churches of Hispalis and Córdoba, the administrative machinery of the Visigothic Church was mobilized to perform the baptismus in vitis, or involuntary baptism, on a scale previously unknown in the Western Mediterranean. These events were presided over by the high clergy, often with the direct attendance of the commites and royal officials who served as the secular guarantors of the process. The liturgical procedure involved the formal renunciation of ancestral faith through the professio, a standardized oath of abjuration that required the participants to explicitly denounce Jewish law, dietary restrictions, and liturgical calendars as superstition and perfidia. The physical act of baptism was performed via immersion or effusion, utilizing the monumental stone fonts that characterized 7th century Iberian church architecture. Following the sacrament, the new converts were assigned Christian names, often those of Gothic nobility or local saints, and were issued a placidum, a binding legal contract in which they pledged their absolute loyalty to the Catholic Church under threat of severe corporal punishment or death. This ritual was not merely a religious transition, but a legal reclassification. It transformed the individual from a protected Jewish subject into a Christianus, thereby subjecting them to the full disciplinary jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical courts. The state required that these ceremonies be documented in parish registers, which served as the primary census tools for monitoring the population's compliance with the new national orthodoxy. The immediate consequence of these forced rituals was the creation of a massive demographic of crypto-Jews, or anusim, who maintained a dual existence to navigate the increasingly hostile Visigothic state. While the outward performance of Catholic piety, attendance at the Mass, participation in the Eucharist, and the public observance of Sunday was mandatory to avoid the penalties of the Lex Visigothorum The internal communal structures of the Jewish faith were driven into the private domestic sphere. Historical evidence from later 7th century councils reveals that many of these converts continued to observe the Sabbath and dietary laws behind closed doors, utilizing the relative privacy of the villa and the urban household to preserve their traditions. This created a state of perpetual tension between the crown's desire for spiritual uniformity and the reality of a fragmented, hidden religious pluralism. The Sisebutian administration attempted to counter this internal resistance by mandating that new Christians spend major religious holidays under the direct supervision of their local bishops, preventing the clandestine celebration of Passover or Sukkot. The state also introduced the cautions, or formal guarantees of faith, which required converts to prove their sincerity through the public consumption of prohibited foods, or the verbal denunciation of their kin who had chosen exile. This era of ritualized coercion failed to achieve the total psychological conversion intended by the episcopal elite. Instead, it institutionalized a culture of suspicion and surveillance that would define Visigothic social relations for the next century. The forced baptisms of 612 did not liquidate the Jewish presence in Iberia, but rather transformed it into a permanent, hidden counterculture that challenged the very purity the sacred monarchy sought to establish. The implementation of the 612 decree introduced a systematic program of state-sponsored generational engineering, articulated through specific legal clauses that mandated the removal of children from the domestic influence of Jewish or recently converted parents. This policy was predicated on the legal doctrine of patria potestas being subordinate to the spiritual welfare of the res publica, allowing the crown to invalidate parental rights in favor of ecclesiastical guardianship. The legislation targeted prepubescent children and adolescents, who were classified by the Officium Palatinum as the most viable subjects for total cultural and religious reconfiguration. By transferring these minors to Christian monasteries, episcopal households, or the estates of the Catholic nobility, the Visigothic state aimed to ensure the absolute extinction of Jewish tradition within a single generation, effectively treating the transmission of ancestral faith as a form of criminal negligence. These children were subjected to a rigorous regime of re-education known as the Institutio Christiana, designed to strip them of their original linguistic, dietary, and liturgical markers. The legal framework required that they be raised in complete isolation from their kin, with strict prohibitions against any form of communication or visitation that might relapse the child into the practices of their ancestors. In the monastic environments of the 7th century, these youths were trained in Latin literacy and Gregorian liturgy, while being indoctrinated into the polemical theology of the Isidorian school. The state viewed these institutions as spiritual laboratories, where the biological lineage of the Jewish community was to be subsumed into the ideological lineage of the Gothic Church. This process was legally binding. Any attempt by parents to hide their children or facilitate their escape to territories outside Visigothic control was met with the total confiscation of family property and the permanent enslavement of the offenders. The administrative oversight of this program was entrusted to the local parochia, which maintained detailed records of the displaced children to prevent their reintegration into the crypto-Jewish underground. Royal edicts from this period specified that these minors were to be married exclusively to Christian-born subjects upon reaching maturity, a measure intended to dilute the demographic distinctiveness of the community through forced miscegenation. This policy of biological erasure complemented the ritual erasure of the baptismal font, creating a two-pronged assault on the continuity of the diaspora. The legal clauses also stipulated that any inheritance due to these children from their exiled or converted parents was to be managed by their Christian guardians, ensuring that Jewish wealth was recycled back into the institutional structures of the Church. By institutionalizing the separation of households, Sisebut transformed the family unit from a private sphere into a site of state intervention. The extinction of the faith was not left to the chance of persuasion, but was enforced through the logistical power of the conventus and the monastery. This period of breaking the households represents the most radical application of Visigothic law, where the state claimed ultimate jurisdiction over the mind and identity of the next generation. The immediate aftermath of these separations left the remaining Jewish enclaves in a state of terminal demographic collapse, as the vital link between past and future was severed by the legislative will of the sacred monarchy. This policy established a precedent for the totalizing social control that would characterize the final decades of the Visigothic kingdom, as the state pursued a vision of a kingdom where diversity was treated as a relic to be forcibly discarded. The expiration of the 12-month ultimatum in 613 AD triggered the largest institutional transfer of wealth in the history of the Visigothic kingdom, as the state moved to liquidate the vast economic infrastructure of the exiled Jewish community. The process was governed by the legal principle of bona damnatorum, where the assets of those who refused the baptismal font were reclassified as forfeited to the royal fiscus. This seizure was executed through a standardized administrative protocol overseen by the comes patrimony, the high official responsible for the king's private and state properties. Detailed inventories, or polyptychs, were compiled by local scribes to document the transition of ownership for urban residences, commercial warehouses, and, most critically, the extensive rural latifundia that formed the backbone of the peninsular economy. The redistribution of these assets followed a strategic pattern intended to consolidate the loyalty of the Gothic Palatine elite and the Catholic episcopate. High-value agricultural properties, particularly the irrigation-dependent vineyards and olive groves of Betica, were often granted to the Church as donations, intended to fund the expansion of monasteries and the maintenance of the growing ecclesiastical bureaucracy. Simultaneously, the king utilized seized Jewish capital to reward the comites and duces who had ensured the military security of the realm during the transition. These land grants were frequently accompanied by the transfer of the instrumentum fundi, the tools, livestock, and non-Christian labor tied to the land, ensuring that the productive capacity of the estates remained intact despite the displacement of their original owners. In the urban centers of Toledo, Seville, and Merida, the state seized control of the specialized industrial quarters, including the tanneries and metallurgical workshops that had been the exclusive domain of Jewish guilds. The royal fiscus either directly managed these enterprises or leased them to Gothic entrepreneurs, attempting to mitigate the immediate economic contraction caused by the loss of Jewish technical expertise. However, the sudden influx of properties onto the state-controlled market led to a significant devaluation of real estate, as the supply of confiscated homes far exceeded the number of qualified buyers within the Catholic aristocracy. This economic volatility necessitated the creation of the Officium Rerum Privatarum, a dedicated subdepartment of the Treasury, tasked with managing the long-term leasing and sale of these newly acquired crown lands. The fiscal impact of the seizure provided King Sisebut with a temporary surge in liquid revenue, which was channeled into the fortification of the northern frontiers and the construction of monumental church architecture. Yet, the long-term consequence was the dismantling of the credit systems and trade networks that had relied on Jewish capital and international connections. By absorbing these private assets into the centralized state and church coffers, the Visigothic monarchy successfully eliminated the economic independence of the Jewish population, but at the cost of crippling the flexible, market-based economy of the late Roman tradition. The 612 expulsion thus finalized the transition to a more rigid, feudalized economic structure, where wealth was no longer derived from commercial exchange, but from the possession of land granted by royal favor. The migration of the exiled Jewish population toward the northern frontier in 613 AD was a regulated movement of displaced persons, channeled through the specific mountain passes of the Pyrenees that connected the Visigothic regnum to the Frankish territories of Septimania and the Merovingian kingdoms. This exodus was facilitated by the Via Augusta and the Roman road networks that remained the primary arteries for terrestrial travel across the Tarraconensis province. Unlike the spontaneous flights of earlier eras, this departure was monitored by the numerarii, royal fiscal officers who ensured that those leaving the kingdom had fully complied with the confiscation orders and possessed the necessary evictio, the formal document of expulsion. The logistical journey was dictated by the seasonal limitations of the high mountain passes, such as the Col de Panisar and the Pertus, where the Visigothic state maintained permanent military garrisons to oversee the border. The destination for many of these refugees was the Frankish kingdom, where the political structure was characterized by a more decentralized authority than the Sisebutian state. In the Merovingian realms of Austrasia and Neustria, the ecclesiastical influence over civil law was not yet as totalizing, and the local Frankish duces often maintained a more pragmatic, Roman-style approach to religious minorities for the sake of urban stability. Many exiles settled in the Septimanian cities of Narbonne and Carcassonne, which, although under Visigothic control, functioned as frontier zones where the enforcement of Toledan edicts was frequently tempered by the proximity to Frankish markets. These border enclaves became essential staging points for the diaspora, allowing families to maintain contact with those who had chosen the baptismal font in the Iberian heartland while remaining outside the immediate reach of the royal officium. The physical journey involved the movement of substantial caravans, composed of the elderly, children, and those fit for travel, carrying only the portable wealth, such as jewelry, coinage, and sacred scrolls, that had escaped the eyes of the royal tax collectors. Historical accounts suggest that these groups were often subject to predatory tolls levied by local mountain tribes and opportunistic Gothic border officials who exploited the refugees' lack of legal standing. Upon reaching Frankish territory, the exiles faced the immediate challenge of re-establishing their socio-economic status in a foreign legal environment. They utilized the commercium, ancient trade agreements, to integrate into the local economies of the Rhone Valley, where their technical skills in viticulture and textile management remained in high demand by the Frankish nobility. This flight to the north represented a significant brain drain for the Visigothic state, as the merchants and scholars who chose exile brought their intellectual and commercial networks to the burgeoning Merovingian courts. The Pyrenees, which had historically been a bridge for cultural exchange, now functioned as a definitive political and religious barrier, separating the purified Gothic kingdom from the more pluralistic societies of the north. The departure of these communities finalized the demographic shift of the 612 Mandate, leaving the northern provinces of Hispania devoid of their ancient Jewish quarters. This movement not only altered the cultural landscape of the Frankish kingdoms, but also solidified the isolation of the Visigothic state, as it traded its international connections for a rigid, localized uniformity. The maritime exodus of 612 and 613 AD utilized the established port infrastructure of the Mediterranean littoral, specifically the harbors of Carthago Nova, Gades, and Malacca, to facilitate the transport of the exiled Jewish population toward the southern shores of the Albaran Sea. This seaborne departure was governed by the Nauclere, or shipmasters, who operated under the jurisdiction of the Visigothic state's maritime regulations, but frequently engaged in the clandestine transport of refugees to territories beyond the king's effective reach. The primary destination for these maritime voyagers was Mauritania Tingitana and the broader North African coast, a region that remained a complex patchwork of Byzantine administrative outposts and autonomous Berber tribal territories. Unlike the religiously homogenized Iberian interior, these African provinces maintained a degree of late Roman pluralism, providing an immediate geopolitical alternative to the rigidities of the Sisebutian edict. In the Byzantine-held cities such as Septim, modern Ceuta, and the coastal enclaves of the Exarchate of Africa, the legal status of Jewish refugees was defined by the Corpus Juris Civilis. While the Eastern Empire also possessed restrictive religious laws, their enforcement in the western frontier zones was often secondary to the pragmatic requirements of border defense and urban commerce. The exiles integrated into the existing Jewish communities of North Africa, which had been revitalized during the Vandal era and the subsequent Byzantine reconquest. These African enclaves functioned as essential hubs for the transmission of intelligence and resources back to the crypto-Jewish networks in Hispania, utilizing the high-speed grain and oil transport routes to maintain a shadow communication system across the Straits of Gibraltar. Simultaneously, a significant portion of the maritime exodus sought sanctuary among the Berber tribes of the interior, particularly those in the Rif and the Atlas Mountains, who had remained largely independent of both Visigothic and Byzantine control. Historical evidence, though often fragmented, suggests that these Jewish groups introduced advanced metallurgical techniques and irrigation strategies to the Berber confederations, facilitating a technological exchange that strengthened the autonomy of these tribal regions. The Berber duces and chieftains, valuing the mercantile connections and administrative literacy of the Iberian exiles, often granted them protected status in exchange for their participation in the trans-Saharan and coastal trade networks. This movement created a demographic bridge between the Iberian Peninsula and the Maghreb, shifting the center of gravity for the Western diaspora toward the south. The departure by sea represented the most definitive break with the Visigothic state, as those who crossed the Mediterranean were physically and legally removed from the annona and the stipendium systems that tied them to the Gothic crown. The loss of these maritime merchants and ship owners severely degraded the Visigothic Navy's auxiliary transport capacity, leaving the southern coast vulnerable to piracy and eventual naval incursions. By the conclusion of this exodus, the maritime landscape of the western Mediterranean had been reconfigured. The purified ports of Hispania were largely silent of the international trade voices that had once connected them to the Levant. This African refugee became a repository of Iberian Jewish culture, where the memory of the patria was preserved in exile, waiting for a future shift in the Mediterranean political order that would eventually allow for a return. The conclusion of the 612 Mandate resulted in a profound structural transformation of the urban fabric in the major administrative and commercial centers of the Visigothic kingdom. In cities such as Seville, Merida, and Toledo, the sudden removal of the Jewish population, estimated to represent a significant percentage of the urban middle class, led to the immediate abandonment of the vici, or specialized residential and commercial quarters. The physical architecture of these districts, characterized by densely packed dwellings and multifunctional workshops, entered a period of rapid deterioration as the state struggled to find suitable Catholic tenants. The closure of the synagogues, which had functioned as the primary communal and educational hubs, left large masonry structures vacant, often subject to the spolia process, where their decorative stones and timbers were repurposed for church construction. The economic paralysis was most visible in the urban marketplaces, where the shuttering of Jewish-owned tabernae and ergasteria disrupted the retail distribution of essential and luxury goods. In Seville, the tanning and leatherworking districts, which relied on specialized techniques for curing hides, became dormant, leading to a shortage of the high-quality equestrian equipment and footwear required by the Gothic military. Merida's role as a financial nexus was severely compromised as the private scriptoria used for contract, drafting, and debt accounting were vacated, leaving behind a vacuum in the city's administrative capacity. The absence of the Jewish mercantile class also meant the cessation of the siliquaticum, the tax on commercial transactions, resulting in a sharp decline in municipal revenues that funded the maintenance of Roman-era aqueducts and defensive walls. Institutional neglect followed the physical departure. The lack of a resident population to manage the cloaca and local drainage systems led to localized flooding and sanitation crises in the former Jewish quarters. This environmental degradation made these districts less attractive for the Catholic nobility, who preferred the more spacious palatia near the royal centers. Consequently, many of the seized homes were eventually partitioned into low-quality tenements for the inquilini, poor agricultural laborers migrating from the countryside, who lacked the capital to maintain the original integrity of the structures. This transition from prosperous commercial zones to decaying peripheral slums represented a permanent loss of urban sophistication for the Visigothic civitas. Furthermore, the silence extended to the intellectual life of the cities. The sudden disappearance of Jewish scholars, physicians, and linguists resulted in the closure of private libraries and study houses, effectively severing the kingdom's link to the broader Mediterranean scientific tradition. The loss of these professional networks meant that the officium palatinum had to rely increasingly on the clergy for administrative literacy, further centralizing power within the church. By 614, the urban landscape of Hispania had been fundamentally reconfigured. The once vibrant pluralistic streets had been replaced by a more uniform, yet significantly impoverished, social order. The physical void left by the expulsion served as a constant reminder of the high economic and cultural price paid for the state's pursuit of religious and ideological totality. The 612 expulsion edict did not receive universal or immediate cooperation from the secular Visigothic nobility, many of whom viewed Sisebut's radical religious mandates as a direct threat to the fiscal and social stability of their provincial jurisdictions. The comites civitatum and the duces, the provincial governors who functioned as the primary intermediaries between the royal center in Toledo and the local populations, were often deeply invested in the economic success of the Jewish mercantile and agrarian classes. These local lords relied on Jewish technical expertise in irrigation management and their extensive credit networks to maintain the profitability of their own estates. Consequently, the archival records of the period, particularly the later legislative complaints of the 7th century, indicate a persistent pattern of palatine friction, where regional authorities utilize their administrative autonomy to delay or subvert the enforcement of the confiscatio and baptismal orders. In provinces like Lusitania and Galaetia, which were geographically distant from the immediate surveillance of the officium palatinum, local counts often facilitated the concealment of Jewish families by reclassifying them as Christian converts without requiring the actual performance of the ritual. This administrative sleight of hand allowed the Jewish population to remain in place and continue their economic activities under a nominal Christian veneer, thus preserving the tax base and the labor supply required by the provincial treasury. These nobles prioritized the utilitas provincialis, the local utility, over the king's pursuit of a singular Gothia. The friction was further exacerbated by the king's decision to bypass secular judges in favor of episcopal oversight for religious cases, a move that the Gothic nobility interpreted as a structural erosion of their traditional judicial prerogatives. The tension between the crown and the nobility also manifested in the handling of the mancipia, or the slave workforce. While the law mandated the seizure of Christian slaves from Jewish owners, some Gothic lords acted as intermediaries, purchasing these slaves in name only while allowing them to remain on their original estates to ensure agricultural continuity. These arrangements were often secured through private pacta or agreements that functioned outside the official legal framework of the state. This resistance was not necessarily rooted in religious sympathy, but in a pragmatic realization that the sudden removal of an entire professional class would precipitate a collapse in the regional supply chains of grain, wine, and textiles. The king's response to this local non-compliance was the introduction of the comiti fine, a severe financial penalty levied against any royal official found to be shielding non-believers or misreporting the progress of the expulsion. This era of internal friction highlighted the fundamental divide between the theocratic ambitions of the Sisebutian court and the decentralized, pragmatic reality of the provincial aristocracy. By attempting to use the Jewish community as a tool for religious homogenization, Sisebut inadvertently created a rift within the Gothic ruling class, forcing the nobility to choose between royal loyalty and economic self-preservation. The shielding of Jewish neighbors by local counts created a patchwork of enforcement across the peninsula, ensuring that despite the absolute language of the 612 edict, the Jewish presence was not entirely liquidated. This persistent subversion by the secular elite would remain a constant theme in Visigothic history, eventually leading to the even more draconian surveillance measures enacted by the Toledan councils in the decades that followed the initial 612 crackdown. By the close of 612 AD, Toledo had been structurally and symbolically transformed into a sacralized administrative fortress where the physical boundaries between the Palatium Regium and the ecclesiastical complex of the primate were effectively dissolved. The city's topography was redefined by the construction of the Praetorium, a fortified royal residence that functioned as the nexus for both military command and theological legislation. This architectural synthesis reflected the totalizing governance of Sisebut, where the royal curia and the episcopal synod operated as a singular bureaucratic engine. The public spaces of the capital, formerly defined by the pluralistic social interactions of the Roman municipium, were now dominated by the ritualistic processions of the officium palatinum and the high clergy, reinforcing a visual narrative of monolithic Catholic authority. The administrative machinery of the capital was reconfigured to support a permanent state of religious surveillance. The scrinia, or royal archives, were expanded to house the burgeoning registers of the conversi, alongside the detailed inventories of confiscated Jewish property. This centralized data management allowed the Crown to monitor the demographic purity of the capital with unprecedented precision, ensuring that the former Jewish quarters remained under the direct supervision of the comes civitatem and the metropolitan bishop. The legal environment of Toledo became increasingly insular, as the city's judges were required to prioritize the canons of the recent councils over any lingering precedents of Roman civil law. This shift ensured that the capital functioned as a legal laboratory for the Gothic peace, where the enforcement of religious uniformity was treated as the highest form of civic order. The economic life of the city was similarly redirected to serve the ideological needs of the sacred monarchy. The royal mint in Toledo increased the production of the gold tremises, utilizing the seized assets of the exiled Jewish community to fund the construction of monumental basilicas and the expansion of the city's defensive circuit. These public works projects were designed to project an image of divinely sanctioned stability and prosperity, masking the underlying economic contraction caused by the expulsion of the mercantile elite. The guilds that remained in the capital were subjected to strict ecclesiastical oversight, with their statutes revised to ensure that only those in full sacramental standing could participate in the city's craft economy. This enforced unity created a facade of social harmony, yet it was predicated on the total exclusion of the diverse professional networks that had previously linked Toledo to the broader Mediterranean world. By the end of Sisebut's first year of radical reform, Toledo had become an ideological citadel, isolated from the pluralistic traditions of its Roman past. The fragile unity of the capital was maintained through a pervasive culture of denunciation and public piety, where any deviation from the state-mandated faith was interpreted as a threat to the security of the regnum. The city's transformation into a strictly Catholic administrative center served as the definitive model for the rest of the kingdom, signaling that the era of negotiated social boundaries had been permanently replaced by a system of state-enforced spiritual totality. The silence of the abandoned quarters was now filled by the bells of the new basilicas, marking the completion of the capital's reimagining as the holy heart of a unified Gothic nation. The immediate economic contraction following the 612 expulsion was characterized by a catastrophic disruption of the negociatores, the professional class of long-distance merchants who managed the kingdom's external trade balances. Because the Visigothic economy functioned as a specialized peripheral market within the broader Byzantine and Mediterranean exchange systems, it relied heavily on Jewish agents to maintain the flow of liquid capital and imported essential commodities. The sudden removal of these intermediaries led to a sharp increase in the price of imported raw materials, such as Egyptian papyrus, Eastern tin, and specialized dyes, which were fundamental to the kingdom's administrative and industrial sectors. This inflationary pressure was compounded by the collapse of the mutuum system, the informal credit markets that sustained urban commerce, as the state's seizure of Jewish assets effectively froze the lending networks that funded seasonal agricultural cycles and municipal infrastructure projects. The technical impact of the expulsion was particularly acute in the highly specialized fields of hydraulic engineering and pharmacology. The loss of Jewish professionals who managed the complex irrigation systems of the Levante and Betica resulted in a measurable decline in crop yields for labor-intensive products like rice and sugar, which had been introduced during the Roman era. In the cities, the closure of Jewish-run apothecai led to a crisis in medical care, as the knowledge of botanical remedies and surgical techniques, preserved and expanded through Jewish links to the Eastern Mediterranean, was not immediately replaceable by the less specialized ecclesiastical infirmaries. This brain drain weakened the state's resilience against recurring outbreaks of the Justinianic plague, as the urban administrative capacity to manage public health and sanitation had been dismantled alongside the communities that provided these services. Furthermore, the fiscal integrity of the fiscus was undermined by the permanent loss of the telenium, or the customs duties collected at the major ports. With the departure of the Jewish-owned merchant fleets, the volume of maritime traffic in Gades and Carthago Nova plummeted, leaving the royal treasury dependent almost exclusively on the jugatio land tax. This shift placed an unsustainable burden on the Catholic peasantry and the minor Gothic nobility, fostering resentment against the Palatine officials who had prioritized theological purity over economic stability. The state's attempt to fill this vacuum by granting trade monopolies to the church proved inefficient, as the monastic institutions lacked the international kinship ties and multilingual literacy required to navigate the competitive Mediterranean markets. The long-term consequence of this contraction was a significant reduction in the complexity of the Visigothic economy. The kingdom regressed into a more autarkic, subsistence-based model where the circulation of gold coinage decreased and barter became the primary medium of exchange in the provincial interior. This economic simplification directly impacted the crown's ability to maintain a standing professional army, forcing Sisebut and his successors to rely increasingly on the bucellari, private militias of the nobility, whose loyalties were localized rather than national. By trading its commercial vibrancy for religious uniformity, the Visigothic state inadvertently eroded the fiscal and technical foundations of its own power, creating an internal fragility that would make the peninsula increasingly vulnerable to the geopolitical shifts of the late 7th century. The emergence of a crypto-Jewish or Anusim culture in the wake of the 612 edict represented a sophisticated communal adaptation to the totalizing surveillance of the Visigothic state. While the ritual of forced baptism theoretically integrated the Jewish population into the Corpus Christianum, in practice, it necessitated the development of a dual identity where public Catholic orthopraxy masked a private, clandestine adherence to ancestral traditions. This underground faith was sustained through the domestic sphere, which was reconfigured as a sanctuary of religious continuity. To avoid detection by the curiales and episcopal inspectors, families utilized the relative autonomy of the household to observe the Sabbath through subtle non-visual cues, such as the preparation of meals on Friday afternoons to avoid lighting prohibited fires during the sacred hours. The preservation of the liturgical calendar required the maintenance of oral traditions and the secret circulation of handwritten fragments of the Torah, often concealed within the walls of urban residences or buried beneath the floors of rural villas. Because the public synagogues had been liquidated, the domestic tablinum, or dining hall, served as a temporary space for communal prayer, conducted in whispers to prevent acoustic detection by neighbors. The dietary laws of kashrut were modified through the use of symbolic substitutes. For instance, the public consumption of pork, a requirement often used by Gothic officials to test the sincerity of converts, was frequently circumvented through bribes or by preparing the meat in ways that rendered it inedible to the observers while appearing to comply with the mandate. This culture of dissimulation, known in legal documents as perfidia occulta, created a persistent administrative anxiety within the officium palatinum, as the state realized that the baptismal font had failed to achieve psychological submission. Leadership within this hidden community shifted from the public office of the rabbi to the private authority of the paterfamilias and the elder women of the household. These individuals became the primary transmitters of the hidden law, teaching children the fundamentals of their heritage under the guise of bedtime stories or oral histories. This generational transmission was fraught with risk. A single slip of the tongue by a child in the presence of a priest or a Gothic official could result in the permanent separation of the family and the enslavement of the parents. To mitigate this danger, a system of code words and allegorical language was developed, allowing the anusum to communicate their religious status to one another in marketplaces and public squares without alerting the secular authorities. The survival of this underground faith was also facilitated by the persistence of international kinship networks that spanned the Mediterranean. Despite the official closure of the borders, clandestine messengers continued to transit between Hispania and the refugees in North Africa and Septimania, carrying liturgical instructions and encouraging news from the diaspora. These links provided the new Christians with a sense of belonging to a broader global community, even as they functioned as a marginalized and monitored caste within the Visigothic state. By the end of the 7th century, this hidden culture had become so deeply embedded in the social fabric of the peninsula that the state's attempts to uproot it through the Toledan councils were increasingly met with frustration. The birth of this underground faith ensured that while the physical structures of Jewish life had been erased, the intellectual and spiritual identity of the community remained an unbreakable, if invisible, component of the Iberian landscape. The legislative trajectory established by Sisebut's 612 edict provided the constitutional framework for an escalating series of exclusionary laws that dominated the 4th through the 17th councils of Toledo. By transforming the Visigothic monarchy into a vehicle for religious homogenization, Sisebut created a precedent where political legitimacy was permanently tethered to the Jewish question. Subsequent monarchs, such as Chintila, utilized the 6th Council of Toledo in 638 AD to decree that no person who was not a Catholic could reside within the boundaries of the kingdom, effectively institutionalizing the concept of the unia religionis as a prerequisite for residency. This period saw the introduction of the placitum, a formal document of submission that converts were forced to sign, which included exhaustive lists of Jewish practices they pledged to abandon under the threat of public stoning or fire. The legal environment became increasingly draconian as the state attempted to close the loopholes created by the persistence of the underground faith. King Recared in the mid-7th century promulgated the Liber Judiciorum, which consolidated secular and canon law into a single code that prioritized the prosecution of Judaizing Christians. This code removed the last remnants of Roman legal protections, categorizing the practice of Jewish rites as a form of sacrilegious treason against the crown. The surveillance apparatus was further expanded under King Erwig, who, during the 12th Council of Toledo in 681, enacted 28 laws that mandated the compulsory attendance of converts at Christian sermons and prohibited them from traveling without episcopal permits. This level of state interference in the private lives of subjects created a pervasive atmosphere of internal hostility and distrust between the Gothic administrative elite and the urban populations. The final stage of this legislative evolution occurred during the reign of Betica, who, at the 16th and 17th Councils of Toledo, 694 AD, accused the Jewish population of conspiring with overseas powers, likely a reference to the burgeoning Umayyad Caliphate, to subvert the Gothic state. This accusation was used to justify the Sententia de Iudaeis, a decree that reduced the entire Jewish and convert population to permanent slavery, distributing them among the Christian nobility and prohibiting them from ever practicing their faith again. Their children were to be permanently removed at the age of 7 to be raised in Christian households. This policy of total enslavement and demographic liquidation represented the absolute limit of Visigothic legislative power. Yet it also signaled the exhaustion of the state's administrative and moral resources. The unintended consequence of these draconian laws was the total alienation of a significant and technically skilled portion of the population. By treating its own subjects as a permanent internal enemy, the Visigothic state eroded the social cohesion necessary to withstand external pressures. The obsession with religious uniformity redirected military and fiscal resources away from the defense of the Mediterranean and Pyrenean frontiers toward internal policing and the management of confiscated estates. When the Umayyad forces eventually crossed the Straits of Gibraltar in 711 AD, they encountered a kingdom that was structurally hollowed out by its own policies of exclusion. The sacred monarchy had succeeded in creating a religiously uniform state, but at the cost of the political stability and communal loyalty required for its survival, leading directly to the rapid collapse of the Visigothic order. The implementation of Sisebut's 612 edict and the subsequent decade of administrative enforcement finalized the transition of the Iberian Peninsula from a late Roman province into a proto-feudal theocratic state. By the conclusion of this era, the legislative landscape of Hispania had been purged of the IUS commune that had historically protected the civic existence of religious minorities. The sacred monarchy had successfully dismantled the institutional structures of the Jewish diaspora, replacing a heritage of urban pluralism with a state-mandated unitas that was visually confirmed by the newly dominant church architecture of the capital and provincial sees. However, this uniformity was largely performative. The kingdom was now inhabited by a significant population of new Christians, whose presence necessitated a permanent state of domestic surveillance and the expansion of the curia into a religious police force. The immediate economic reality of this fractured kingdom was one of increasing insularity and technical stagnation. The loss of the Jewish-managed trade routes to the Levant and the dismantling of the credit systems in the Betica and Tarraconensis regions resulted in the contraction of the monetary economy. The gold tremisses was increasingly redirected toward ecclesiastical endowments and the maintenance of the comitatus, while the provincial markets regressed into localized barter systems. The technical expertise required for the upkeep of Roman hydraulic systems and the specialized manufacture of textiles and glassware became scarce, as the professional guilds had been fragmented by the expulsion of their most skilled practitioners. This decline in urban complexity led to a ruralization of power, where the Gothic nobility's influence was tied more strictly to the control of land and agricultural labor than to the vibrancy of municipal life. Politically, the Visigothic state entered the 7th century as an ideological fortress, isolated from the shifting Mediterranean order. The centralization of power within the Toledan councils had created a rigid hierarchy that prioritized dogmatic purity over the flexible administrative adaptation required for frontier defense. The legal precedents established in 612 functioned as the definitive template for medieval European jurisprudence regarding religious minorities, introducing the concepts of state-mandated conversion and the total confiscation of property as legitimate tools of sovereign power. While Sisebut's successors continued to refine these draconian measures, they did so within a kingdom whose internal cohesion was increasingly fragile. The Gothic peace was maintained through the constant application of judicial force, creating a social order where suspicion of crypto-faith undermined the trust between the crown and its subjects. On the threshold of the Middle Ages, Hispania stood as a religiously uniform but structurally weakened entity. The ancient pluralism that had defined the peninsula since the era of the Phoenicians and Romans had been effectively erased, replaced by a theopolitical model that viewed diversity as a form of sedition. The 612 expulsion was not merely a demographic event. It was the final closure of the classical world in Iberia and the beginning of a centuries-long era of religious confrontation. As the state focused inward on the purification of its borders, it remained blind to the rising geopolitical pressures beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The fractured kingdom, bound by an enforced and brittle unity, was now legally and spiritually prepared for a monolithic identity. Yet it lacked the social vitality to sustain that identity against the coming historical storms of the 8th century.